Hello everyone and welcome to Unit 3, Lecture 1. If you can believe it, we are already in week 4. We're starting our third unit. The main theme for this week is nonprofit organizational structure. And before I get into that, I just want to comment briefly on the attire. I hope you all enjoyed your weekend as much as I know I did. I might have had a minor heart attack, but other than that, it was fantastic. And you know what? My ego still hasn't gotten back to normal levels yet, even though I had absolutely nothing to do with the win. So I'm just going to rock some Patriot gear for your enjoyment throughout the duration of this lecture. You're welcome. All right, so as usual, we begin the lecture with a review of last week's lecture. That was Unit 2, Lecture 2. And the focus of that lecture was on the Hopkins and Gross chapter that explored the legal framework of the nonprofit sector. And in particular, what that chapter did was really review some different categories of tax-exempt organizations. So beyond the 501c3s or private charities that we typically think of, this got into veterans groups, fraternal organizations, and different types of categorizations that exist within the IRS designation. And of course, the book also made the point that not all nonprofits will classify. There are still a number of organizations that are legally unincorporated, but within this particular category of legal code, what are some of the distinctions we can use to recognize different types of nonprofits and the purposes that they serve? So after that, we reviewed the idea of legislative versus political activities law. Again, legislative focusing on lobbying, which is permissible in nonprofit settings so long as that lobbying activity doesn't constitute a substantial part of the nonprofit's activities. And as we talked about last week, for now, nonprofit organizations are legally prohibited from engaging in political activity, meaning activity that endorses a particular candidate for elected office. But with the potential repeal of the Johnson Amendment on the line, we could see that this type of legal code is overturned, which would allow nonprofit organizations to engage in political activity. And it's something that might seem a bit, random or on the fringe of what we're talking about when we think of managing nonprofit organizations. But if we get back to that 10,000-foot view of the sector, this really might have implications on the way that nonprofits conduct business and perceptions of legitimacy from the public if this new tenor takes over. And lastly, the chapter from Hopkins and Gross got into some ideas of governance. Part of that was through the structure and purpose of the IRS, but it also introduced the structure for boards of directors, which is a nice segue into what we're covering in this unit, which really looks at organizational structure and boards. So let's move into that. So our main theme again for this unit is organizational structure, and we can really think of this as happening in 4 different components. So we're looking at structural forms, boards of directors, executive directors, and then this concept of governance. So the relationship between boards and, I've heard executive directors shortened as EDs. I just don't particularly like that phrase, so I'm just going to keep using executive directors. But governance gets at the relationships between boards and executive directors, and also the relationship between executive directors and staff, boards and staff, and how these all work together with stakeholders to contribute to the programs and services that a nonprofit is putting out. So I know for this week that we read 2 chapters from Sherhart and Bielefeld, Chapter 4, which looked at organizational structure, and Chapter 9, which looked at boards of directors. But for this lecture, I really want to focus on that first part, structural forms. There was a lot of information in that chapter. It was very technical, very dense. I've seen already some early comments in the lectures about the fact that it was really kind of academic in nature. So I thought it would be helpful for this lecture to distill the 7 types of organizational forms that are presented in the book. You might have noticed I had a typo in the threaded discussion. I mentioned that there were 6 types. I forgot the virtual network. In fact, there are 7. I'll remedy that today during the lecture. But by focusing on the structural forms, hopefully we can get a better understanding of what those look like and what those mean. And then next week, I will segue into the boards and executive directors, because even though we covered boards as part of this week's readings, the governance structures, the relationships between board members and the relationships between boards and executive directors actually provides a nicer point of comparison than just introducing them individually. So with that in mind, I'm going to vary up the lecture format a little bit this week. Typically, I go through the main theme and then questions and some application. But to clarify some of the more dense terminology that was used in Chapter 4, I want to integrate the application and substantive topical coverage into each slide. And the way that I'm going to approach that is by presenting a visual accompaniment to the different structures that were presented. Hopefully this will help illuminate or make clear some of the distinctions between these forms. They're not necessarily inherently discernible when you're reading about them at a paragraph at a time, but hopefully these sample guides to what these structures look like in practice or in form will help you make sense of these concepts a little bit better. So think of the visual cue as the application piece. So the first structural form that was presented in the book was mechanistic structure. And we can really think of the mechanistic structure as coming out of that Weberian ideal type bureaucracy. Tasks are centralized, there's a clear hierarchy of authority that's in place, and communication flows vertically from the top, which issues a directive, down through the bottom where those programs are implemented on the ground level. And so we can think of mechanistic structure in this very simple organizational chart that I have up top. So you've got the board of directors, you've got a series of different committees, you've got an executive director, and then throughout that you have these specialized groups or teams within the organization. But this flow, this kind of directional arrow from top to bottom, really symbolizes the structure in a nice concrete form. The other thing that was part of the threaded discussion question was to link the 7 dimensions of structure to the organizational forms. So what I've done here, you can see on the table on the right-hand side, is present the dimensions of structure and whether or not they fit with the type. What we can see in the mechanistic structure is that all of these elements, formalization, complexity, centralization, specialization, standardization, professionalism, and hierarchy, all fit in quite nicely. And this is consistent with the definition of mechanistic structure to begin with. But we'll see throughout some other structures that all of these things are not there. It's particularly antithetical when we compare this to the organic structure model, where we're not going to see as much emphasis on things like formalization, centralization, or hierarchy of authority in particular. Now, this table that I have created, I have not replicated for the other types. The reason for that is because the discussion question for this unit, I really want you all to start making these links, but if it helps for you to make yourself a table and just sort of check off the degree to which you think these things are present, that might be one way to wrap your head around these dimensions of structure and the ways to which, or the degrees to which, they fit within the structural forms. So after mechanistic, we move down, we have, of course, the antithesis to that, which is the organic structure. Here we sort of forego the classic forms of hierarchy and centralization and instead really emphasize this idea of shared decision making. And we can see this encapsulated in the visual display that we have here, where everything from governance to programs, operations, are all divided with some degree of equal voice between the different members. So whether you're a board of director, you're an advisor, a stakeholder, an executive director, or a staff member, you will have a say in those decision-making opportunities. So obviously the standards of communication, your measures of effectiveness are going to be more egalitarian and community-driven as opposed to this very rigid militaristic style. We think of mechanistic, I automatically go military. We think of organic, I think egalitarian. And so those are the 2 ideal types that were presented. Of course, they don't always fit perfectly like that in practice. That's why they're called ideal. But of the 2, the book did mention that the organic structure was preferred among nonprofit organizations, and they attributed that really to the values that are in nonprofits, this sense of bringing people together for a stake in the mission, whether that's stakeholders or staff or volunteers, all coming together and having this sense of shared purpose and shared responsibility. The other element that might explain why an organic structure is preferred is the reality that most nonprofit organizations exist on budgets of less than $500,000 a year. The specific statistic will vary a little bit. The Urban Institute, as of 2013, indicated it was about 67% of nonprofits that are really small in stature. Not to say that they don't make great contributions, but just that from a financial perspective, they're operating on these much smaller scales relative to these big organizations when you think of things like the Red Cross or Heifer International, Boy Scouts, whatever those organizations are, those are not the typical majority of nonprofit organizations. And so when we look at something like the organic structure, it makes sense because it's really well suited to small organizations where you have a handful of full-time staff, you've got a certain number of volunteers that you coordinate, and a really finite number of programs. It makes it a lot easier to instill that type of community-based communication where your management practice is more facilitation than it is direction or devolution of authority. So that's something to keep in mind with the organic structure. But beyond the 2 ideal types, we were also introduced to 5 additional forms that we might see in practice. So the first of these forms, and I jumped a slide, hold on one second here, is the functional structure. And what this means, if we take the term literally, means that authority or purpose is driven by function. I know, it's not a super helpful word to describe it. Another word might be by department. So we see here in this yellow graph, it's a very simplistic representation, but the idea is that within the nonprofit, you will have different departments dedicated to different tasks. Those will all be staffed with people in pursuit of that task. So as the book states, you can have a department of fundraising, department of marketing, department of service provision, and that will really structure the organization within those departments. Now, where this form might have gotten a little bit confusing is when we compare that to the next one. Here we go, divisional structure, whereas instead of being divided by function, we're divided by product. Now, it's not a clear distinction, and the easiest way, I think, to wrap your head around it is that within the functional structure, what you'll see is one department with staff with that particular set of expertise. So you will have staff that have marketing expertise or fundraising expertise, programming expertise, training, whatever that area is. In the divisional structure, based on each set of products, or it might be services, you'll see that each team has a diverse set of experts in that staff. So if we look at the structure that's presented in this visual, I'm going to see if the mouse works here. So you've got product A, and then within that you have teams of people that do your research and development, your manufacturing, your finance, your marketing, and your customer service. Now, of course, this is a corporate example and not a nonprofit. I couldn't find a visual to represent the nonprofit equivalent of this, but the idea is still the same, that instead of having divisions or departments of staff with similar expertise, you have departments that are driven by the product or service, and then within that you have fully rounded teams that produce that one aspect of the nonprofit's work. Hopefully that helps clarify. Moving on, the next form that we see is the geographical structure. The easiest way to wrap your mind around this is really just to say, for those large-scale nonprofits, even though they're not necessarily the common form, but for those nonprofits that have chapters in different geographic locations, each location needs to be managed to some degree independently. It needs to be its own functioning entity. It needs to have its own series of evaluation processes, its own determinations of effectiveness, and its own internal management processes for making sure that the people who are on the ground are doing the work that gets those programs and services implemented in the communities. And when you think about these large-scale organizations, you need to have these chapters in order to effectively deliver that service or that program. And so what you see here, and it was an example, I think that was in the textbook, with the Boy Scouts of America. And the graph is a little bit small, but the important thing here is that you see it divided by region. So you've got your Western, your Northeast, your Central, your Southeast, and then within those regions, you will have your own almost autonomous structures. I use that word lightly because at the end of the day, there is some authority that has to get evolved back up to your board of directors, to your executive director. But for all intents and purposes, on the ground, each group is operating independently. The next one is the matrix structure. This is always exciting when you mix different forms, different groups of and styles of leadership. And so we see this represented here in this form where you've got products and functions. So you might have a team in a large-scale nonprofit where they're working towards a particular product or service. You have employees that report to that product manager, but you also have the product manager who is coordinating with the service provider. And so there's this kind of joint level of authority. The book does make the case that it's the most complex of the organizational forms. They're not kidding about that. Again, the only representation I could find was a corollary from the corporate world to really explain this. And so even though it looks confusing, if you take some time when I put the slides up and kind of go through it, hopefully it'll make a little more sense. I will give you a bit of insight though. You might not want to use this form when it comes time to the final paper. I mean, if you're someone who really likes a challenge, then by all means, go for it. I am not saying don't do it, but there are other more simplistic forms that I think you can make a case as to why those are appropriate for the nonprofit that you're starting. So just a heads up, you've gotten the out to not have to use the matrix structure. And finally, the one that I forgot, which is actually kind of horrible because most of my background is in networks, so I can't believe I forgot the form that has network in the title. But the virtual network structure, it's really something that's up and coming. We typically still think of nonprofits as being these brick and mortar buildings. Some of them are more formalized. We might think of more of the informal grassroots types of efforts that happen in local communities, but we think of actually having an office or a headquarters where decisions are made and the decisions to implement programs are started. But increasingly what we're seeing, particularly through the use of technology, is organizations that really span these boundaries. And so this might be a form where you have an international nonprofit organization that has multiple headquarters, but more commonly what the term the virtual network structure refers to is the fact that you have a singular kind of network, a singular nonprofit entity that is going to contract out for services. So rather than keep those things in-house, they're going to expand their ability to provide services by using entities, probably corporate, that are already well equipped to do that. And what we can see here, again, it's a corporate representation, but the idea is that this kind of would be your nonprofit here, this lead corporation, and then you're going to outsource a particular program or service to a partner. It could be, again, situated by geography. It could be based on expertise. There are lots of different reasons why you might choose to do this, but the idea is that you're going to contract out in order to fulfill that mission. So the fun part, I think, about this unit in particular is the questions or food for thought section. And the reason that is the case, as you can see from the first question, is because why does structure matter? I saw that a little bit. I think it was Katie in the discussion who was like, this is great if you're starting a nonprofit, but once you're already in the environment, who cares? Or a couple of other people who commented, oh, we're kind of giving it an academic bent to what I see happen in practice. It might be a nice explanatory tool, but what does it actually matter? And it gets back to a perception that I think people have when we talk about the idea of managing an organization. People generally think of three things: managing people, managing money, and managing programs. But we don't often think about the way that the structure of the organization itself provides constraints in which those decisions are made. And the structure itself is one thing. That's why we're starting with this introduction. It provides these flows of communications. They have their own sets of strengths and weaknesses. Particularly, we saw the differences between, vertical linkages, horizontal linkages, the way that these communications might enhance effectiveness or might otherwise compromise it if they're not executed well. But the other thing to keep in mind with structure is that you might have two structures that look identical on paper, and they might not operate that way in practice. So it's important to get a sense of what that structure looks like and what's it intended to do before seeking to make alterations to the way in which your employees operate in a given environment. So as an example, I think I've mentioned this to you all before in an earlier lecture, but I currently work with the Division of Probation Services. This is a state level organization. Colorado is very decentralized, so the judicial districts with whom we work have a large degree of autonomy. But our office, the division as a whole, exists really to help standardize things like training, evaluation, implementation, compliance with statute, and the like. And because I operate in a state environment, on paper, we look very much like the mechanistic structure. We have a hierarchy, we have a division director, we have unit managers. Within that, we have people of different ranks. If you look at that structure on paper, the idea is that decisions flow from top to bottom, and permission must flow from one level up to the top of the chain. And in practice, it actually functions much more like the organic structure. I mean, sure, there are certainly projects that need approval. I can't just go down, a rabbit hole because I'm having a good time with a question and not have to explain the purpose of doing that. That's going to exist in any organization. But the actual flows of communication really don't route through that very linear flow of authority. But the structure itself might have an implication if we're looking at an organization like the military. Well, that has a similar structure, believe it or not, on paper that my division does, and yet the way decisions are made in the military are very different. Again, it doesn't mean that my structural form is better and the military's is worse. I mean, they're coordinating millions of people every day, so something's getting done correctly as far as management is concerned. But it is to say, when you're in your own organization on the ground, it might not matter to you whether you're operating in the functional structure or the matrix structure at face value, but it will have an effect on the pattern of communication, the number of programs that are appropriate for you to implement. So there are implications to structure and the ways in which leadership, which we'll talk about kind of in a couple of weeks, but the ways in which people are allowed to interact within those environments, because if nothing else, organizational structure creates the organizational culture. And then the culture itself can be altered by the people that you have working within it. And that's where the beauty of flexibility comes in. But without understanding how the organization is structured to begin with, we might not always have that clear sense of purpose. And so the different structural forms, the next question, how do they affect effectiveness? That's something that I'd like you all to think about as you're working through the discussion questions for this week. Obviously, as the book mentions to some degree, and I think your experience will really help round this out for you, is that these different forms, they're not perfect. They're not, despite the early labels of the mechanistic and the organic, they're not ideal types in the sense of this is how you must structure an organization to be effective. But being aware of what the strengths and weaknesses are with each type of form might help your organization become more effective in the long run. So for instance, we might think about, the implications of if you have all these individual teams of people in the divisional structure, right? They're all working for this particular product or service. They all have their own teams. Well, is that a particularly efficient solution? Is there communication between those teams to ensure that they're doing complementary work in joint pursuit of the mission, but that they're not overlapping? Right? Because the challenge with that type of structure is bringing people together for that shared sense of purpose. A downside to the organic structure might be what happens when a personality type comes in that has a skill set or just a natural inclination to be more of a leader. How do you allow that person to share their vision and their experience, but not do it at the expense of this communal-based leadership model where all of a sudden people are feeling stifled or they're not feeling valued? So even though the structures seem very technical, they do have implications on the ground, whether or not we're attributing it to the form of that structure itself. So just be thinking about that. I know it sounds like perhaps there's a bit of a justification of why we're studying structure. That comes, I think, just from me My background really is in studying organizational structure, particularly with networks that operate across sectors, of which nonprofits occupy a very central role in the work that I do. But I'm just inherently interested in structure and the effects that the quality of relationships in different forms have on our ability to provide effective services. But beyond my own interest, I also think there's a value in getting you all to think about some of these ideas and the implications that structure has on the organizations that you are a part of or that you would like to be a part of or study further. So to wrap up our preparation for next week, we are going to be moving into week 5. It's a continuation of unit 3. We've got 2 reading assignments for next week. Share Hart and Gilfield chapter 10, that's going to focus on executive directors, and then an article by McCluskey that's available on Canvas that asks us to rethink about nonprofit organization governance. So it really delves into some of the challenges that are associated with traditional forms of governance and how we might overcome those challenges. And even though you don't have anything due besides the threaded discussions, which will always start on Thursday, I know that you will eagerly and patiently await the return of your nonprofit profile grades that you will be turning in this Sunday on Canvas. So I think that wraps up the lecture for this week. Hopefully it was informative for you. As always, if you have questions or points that you would like further clarification on, feel free to reach out to me or within your discussion groups for comments, and I'm happy to provide additional feedback. So thank you so much. Thank you for looking at this beautiful, beautiful hat for the past 30 minutes. Have a fantastic weekend. Good luck getting your papers out, and I will see you next week. Take care.